Hey everyone, welcome to the CyberHub Engage podcast. I have an amazing episode today. Really excited about this one. It's going to be so good that you're going to listen to this and then share it with all your friends and colleagues because it's just going to be that good. I'm Dave Excell with Featurespace here with me in the studio. Before we get started though, we're going to do our ceremonial espresso shot from Nespresso. Sponsor us. That's all I drink is espresso, Dave. That's all I drink. I don't drink I can't go and get black coffee. I just can't. It tastes like dark water for me. And so I only drink espressos. That's all I drink all day. I have 4 machines in my home.
In case one breaks.
I literally have a backup machine upstairs in my bar, under my bar, that in just case one of my machines stops working, by the time they fix it, I've got a backup machine. Because if I don't have that, I flip. So you've got Indonesian roast, I've got an Ethiopian roast, and we will, you can take this like a tequila, or you can just sip it like an Italian European. The Italians, they sip the espresso. Yeah. They're very sensual about their espressos, the Italian. Every time you're in Italy, they're like, hey, espresso.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Cheers. Yeah.
This is good though. Dark and good. And that's how we get going. I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, Get Smart Eye. That's Get Smart Eye, like your eye, EYE.com. It's a new security company that's focused on your privacy. How many of you guys have eyes around watching your screens, your phones, your tablets, no matter where you are? It can be your own office, an airport, a train station, a co-working space, and even a coffee shop, right? But there's some documents and some information that really needs to stay away from prying eyes. That's where Get Smart Eye comes in. They're using the latest biometric technology to give you complete control over the documents you send and who sees them. Whether you're viewing them yourself or sending them for someone else to view them, the Get Smart Eye technology ensures that whoever's seeing it is the right person. And should someone who shouldn't see it grab a look at it, it gets the document to disappear and won't reopen it until it verifies the identity of the person you sent it to. So to get more information, go to getsmarteye.com/James. Again, that's getsmarteye.com/James. Again, getsmarteye.com/James. I've got Dave Excell, founder, CTO of Featurespace. You guys have been around for a very, very long time.
Yeah, we have, yeah.
2005, when I was doing the research on Featurespace, I was just absolutely fascinated of the kind of work you guys do. But how did your path into, I want to say cyber, before it was cyber, you guys were kind of the traditional fraud organization, were you not?
Well, and even before then, we spun out out of the university more just looking at applications of, I guess now what we call machine learning and AI, and looking at what are the different types of problems that we could solve. And we worked with a variety of different organizations before we really found our feet in terms of the fraud prevention market as being a great application for the technology that we'd built.
When I was kind of looking over your biography, your journey into creating this company is insane. Can you just share with our viewers a little bit about your background and how it all got started for you?
Yeah, so I guess I grew up in Australia and did my undergraduate degree there in engineering and IT. And then while doing that course, I was really fascinated with the application of sort of statistics and how we could then teach computers to learn things. And then that then inspired me to then want to go and do a PhD, and also in the process think of a way of starting a business. So I was applied for lots of different university positions and was accepted, and then received some scholarships to study at Cambridge University over in the UK. So then decided to pack my bags and move over there. So moved from Canberra to Cambridge and started my PhD in the signal processing group there, and just learned a lot about the different types of technologies and algorithms that were being built in that environment. And a lot of it was about building algorithms that would adapt and evolve over time. So how they could continually observe new data elements, feed those back into the models, and then make new predictions or outcomes based on that continual learning. And then that fascinated with me about how we learn as individuals ourselves is we continually interact with the environment, we make mistakes, we correct from those mistakes. So how could we bring those two things together and really start to teach a machine how to understand human behaviors and interpret those, which is the underlying premise of how we started Featurespace, is being a behavioral analytics and being able to apply those algorithms to learn human behaviors.
I think human behavior is one of the most interesting elements in general, right? I mean, if you look at some of the social media algorithms where they try to look at human behavior one way or another, there's kind of what I like to call a secret behind it now, where people are, they're talking about algorithms and AI and understanding human behavior. But your company, you specifically kind of do that in the financial services firms, right? In identifying weird human behavior when it comes to purchasing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the really fascinating things about us as people is we're very habitual. We like to do the same thing over and over again.
Right.
And that's sort of our comfort zone. So naturally, we'll wake up at around the same time. We'll have coffee or espresso around the same time. All of those things are things that make us comfortable. And that's essentially what we then applied into the financial services area, looking at what was the sequence of transactions that you normally do, and then what is sort of outside of that. What are the anomalies, or what are the changes of behavior that we wouldn't expect? But in the same context as we're not robotic, we don't do precisely the same things all the time. We have birthdays, we buy presents for people, we go on holiday. So how do you bring in those contextual changes to understand whether or not it's really you or not that's doing that?
Or you travel from country to country, like yourself, Australia, UK, now you're in the US. I mean, those are also kind of monumental changes. And as you travel around, how difficult is it to really kind of apply human behavior to people who travel? Because we live in a global world, right? The rise of kind of low-cost airlines has made international travel. I mean, in Europe, you can go from London to Krakow in Poland for like £30. I mean, you can't go from here to Marietta for $30. An Uber costs more to get you there, but in England you can take from London, you can go to Krakow, Poland for a weekend for £30. I mean, how difficult is it to really get a computer to understand those kind of specific human behaviors?
So it's challenging, because it's how do you give the computer the data to be able to make those observations and to retain that history? And that's where it becomes really challenging in large-scale systems where you have billions and billions of transactions and like hundreds of millions of users, is how do you retain that information on each of those people individually? Where a lot of the applications of machine learning have done that more holistically. So they've looked at the whole population and said, does that make sense? And how we've changed that around is we look at each person, each merchant, each device, and we say, does that make sense for them? Does it make sense for that person to be shopping at this particular merchant at this time of day? And bring all of those pieces of information together individually rather than holistically.
When you started this company, obviously in 2005, the term cybersecurity probably didn't exist for anyone.
No.
How was security a priority at the time of launching this product, meaning securing the product itself, or was it kind of an afterthought at the very beginning?
I guess it was always a priority because we were selling to organizations where security was an issue, so we needed to make sure that it met all of their requirements. I guess we're fortunate for a lot of our deployments where we're sort of deployed within the firewalls of a lot of organizations, but still with us we have our own solutions that we manage, and for those we need to make sure that they're as secure as we can make them, because we live by our reputation. So as a company that specializes in fraud and data, a data breach for us would be catastrophic. So we need to be very aware of all the potential risks and threats and make sure that we manage those appropriately.
When you started the company, when did you realize, Dave, that you needed a chief information security officer?
So I guess it's a great question. So it was, as an organization, which I guess we're selling a product to other customers, is the focus is always on, can we meet their requirements, and are we at a point where we've got all of the requirements to satisfy all of their information security needs, all of their compliance and risk needs. And as we grew, we needed to have a person that was focused on that particular area rather than it being part of someone else's job, which was, I guess, how we managed it in the early days, is that the organization was small enough and the product was contained enough that we could have a few people that would be able to understand how the product was being secured itself, how us as an organization were securing our own infrastructure and our own technology deployments. And then as that grew and grew, we got to a point where we said, well, we really need someone that owns and has complete responsibility for all of our information security policies, understanding, making sure we're using best practice and oversight of all of that as we build the product and deliver that out to our customers, and also managing our own deployment environments to make sure they're as secure as we can make them.
It's one of the common challenges that you always hear from chief information security officers is the path of product development and innovation to security isn't always, they don't always run in the same race. I mean, if, innovation is Usain Bolt in the Olympics, security is, the long marathon that's just, no one's really watching until people get to the end line. Do you find how do you overcome those challenges as a founder of a company?
And I think you have to embrace it all the way from the beginning is we need to have a culture where security is a given, as it has to be there. So if we're not secure, if we don't trust our or sort of give our customers' data as much respect as we can, then our reputation in the industry disappears overnight. So we don't exist without having both a secure product and a secure environment ourselves. And then I think it's more an opportunity as well, is how can our customers use our product to be more secure themselves? How can they do that without introducing friction when you go and check out your items when you're buying something online or when you're interacting with your bank? How can we make sure that experience is secure and protecting that individual customer's data while also making sure that the organization is protecting themselves from all their cyber threats?
As I was reading about the journey of Featurespace, and it kind of lit up every single bulb I've ever spoken about on the show for the last year, which is we're so focused on detection and security, no one's looking at proactive. And you kind of stumbled into cyber. I mean, you're not a security company by no means, but you've kind of stumbled where your technology can actually help a CISO on top of protecting, the CFO from fraudulent transactions and doing all the classic fraud things. It can actually help organizations address cybersecurity as well. When did you realize kind of Featurespace actually fit into that box?
Well, I guess where fraud is usually the outcome of a data breach, and that's sort of where the monetization happens. And I guess it's almost like the classic software development is you don't want to find a design issue right when you're about to release the product to your customers, is you want to identify that up front. So I guess as we started working more and more with customers, it was, well, this is where we see the fraud take place, but what was the telltale signs up front of that? So even with some of our retail banking customers, is traditionally they would just look to identify fraud when the payment was being made. But if we can look holistically much more at the customer, so how did they log on? How did they interact with the online digital portal? So we can get much better insight and information about the customer to identify potentially malware or an account takeover at that particular time before any funds are exited out of the account.
I won't ask you any specific questions because I'm one of those that when I'm at a big conference or I'm speaking to someone who develops something to trace what bad people are doing, I realize bad people are probably watching this very show, trying to get a little insight. We see them at big security conferences. I absolutely love it when no one's really vetting who they're talking to. Well, who are you with? Well, that's not important. Well, what do you do? Well, we build these great ways to get a hacker in your network right away, and you're like, So how do you do that? And the salesperson's all excited. Is like, I got a sale. And that's not really always the case. But how have you seen hackers monetize data that they get through your product? I mean, what are some of the trends that helps you notice when, post data breach or even pre-data breach? Sometimes, I mean, it takes you don't even know there's a breach until something like you guys come in and go, hey, we have a trend here of something that's going on that we should possibly investigate. What are some of the common, trends that you see with that maybe someone who's listening and watching can be like, oh, wow, I see that happening in my company. We should probably take a look at it.
Yeah, and I guess it always continues to evolve. So I guess where we spend a majority of our time is looking at sort of card transactions. And I guess there's been lots of changes in the industry where historically it was much more about attacking the physical device. So there were skimmers to be able to read the card details, and then you could rewrite those onto the magnetic strip to make transactions that way. And then I guess it's turned much more into cyber, where there's data breaches. You can easily go onto the dark web. You can buy thousands of compromised card details, and then that's where it gets perpetrated online. And I guess that's key for us, is looking at where we see history of that cardholder data to then start to say, does it make sense in terms of where this transaction is coming through? And then even more starting to look at the bigger data breaches of more personally identifiable information, and then how that information is being used either to create accounts in people's names, or even further being able to create synthetic IDs, so which is a big trend at the moment with some of the changes that were made in terms of how social security numbers have been constructed. Makes it much harder for organizations to validate if the social security number is truly theirs. And then you're almost seeing the fraudsters starting to create credit history for synthetic people, and then it's starting to build that up over time. So the actual investment in that process, it's not days or sort of minutes, it's like months or years in terms of the investment that's going in to sort of create something that can then be busted out or monetized by the fraudsters or the hackers.
That's so fascinating, simply because of the fact most people think of a hacker as someone sitting in a basement, or just a random person in a coffee shop. What the movies and TV makes you feel like hackers are, and they're really not. They're very sophisticated. They study how different organizations handle fraud and what are their kind of risk appetite, and to go after that. How has new technology helped identify kind of the sophistication of these new hackers? You started talking about AI and machine learning. How does that kind of help with that?
Well, I guess it helps us observe the customer more, so we have more data points to start to, for us, understand what does good look like. So what is a customer that we want to enable a transaction to take place? And I guess it has its sidebar into some of the privacy issues that you start to see with large organizations that have lots of data. But how we're using that data is how do we get a very good signal or information to be able to start to sort of authenticate you in the background to make sure that we trust that this is an interaction that you're trying to do. So I guess new technology helps us have a bigger observation period of you as a customer leading up to those particular data points to start to. So we see it more as how do we gain trust in understanding who you are, rather than necessarily trying to find out how bad you are. So we look at it the other way around.
You look at it from the point of view of, what is the good that he does? Is he paying his electric bill on the 10th of every month? Is he paying his credit card on the 15th, so forth? And those are the kind of the trends, the points that you guys more look to judge someone by, rather than, oh, he was in Moscow for 2 days.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had that happen to me when I lived in Israel for 6 years. I spent about a year in Kiev.
Yeah.
And I would travel to Kiev every Monday morning, come back to Israel every Thursday night. And over time, my first about 3 weeks in Kiev, I didn't understand that you don't just hand someone your credit card to pay for something. They have to come to you with a machine.
Yeah.
They stand right in front of you. So I handed someone my card, because that's what you do in any normal country in the world.
Yeah.
And the next day I get a phone call from my bank in Israel, and it says, "We know you were in Kiev yesterday, but are you in Moscow today?" To which I replied, "No, I'm not in Moscow. I am still in Kiev. Why would you be asking me?" "Well, someone's trying to process your card at a store in Moscow for $5,000. And I go, "That's not me."
No.
But that's a very kind of, I guess, simple way of identifying someone. But people travel today. I mean, that's just... people can be in 5 different places in one day, or 3 different places in one day. How hard is it for algorithms and AI to really identify authentic and non-authentic transactions?
And it's a challenge. That's why we use machine learning to be able to do its best at determining those differences and trying to understand. So the first time that you travel somewhere, Maybe we can look at signals prior to that. So have you purchased parking at the airport? Have you bought a coffee at the airport? So when you start to do that, we know, well, you're not going to be transacting in your local environment, and then we can start to see, well, where are the areas that you could start to travel to from that particular location. So it's trying to build as much insight as you can through that. But then also looking at when you do travel, usually one of the first transactions will be an authorization at a hotel, because that's where you're going to be staying, or it's at a taxi. If your first transaction in a new location is at a shop, then you've got to think, well, how did they actually pay to get there? Especially through all the ways in which we're using like Uber and Lyft, we see a lot of those authentications go through those channels.
That's so fascinating, because that kind of gets back to how Featurespace is kind of separating itself from everyone else, and kind of watching how you guys have developed your product is your ability to use technology, but also adapt to the new ways consumers behave. Because I feel like, when you my dad's 60 some odd, almost 70 years old. He doesn't travel with a credit card anywhere. I mean, the guy still walks around with hundreds of dollars of cash in his pocket.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so funny, but I flew my dad to Italy, and we're spending 4 days in Italy. And the first thing he does when we get to Italy, he changes his money to euros, right? Yeah. Next thing he does, I had a driver come pick us up, so he's tipping the driver. So up until now, all of the fraud indicators in that system would have cut him off. And but that's exactly what happened when he went to try to use his card at a coffee shop in Rome. His card was declined. And so he's like, what? And when he called his bank, that was exactly, they were like, well, Mr. Azar, are you in Rome? And he went, yes. Okay, we'll note, how long are you there for?
Yeah. And that's the classic way of solving that at the moment, is to then put those travel flags on cards. But then you have a social engineering attack of the fraudsters actually phoning up and doing that on behalf of customers themselves. So
that's crazy. I mean, that's just to think of how not only the level of sophistication, but how good you have to be while still giving customer service. I think that's the hardest piece in your field, right? Is how do you provide a technology that's so good that a customer feels it's seamless without really interrupting them and making them, there's nothing more embarrassing than having your card declined when you're in line somewhere. I think that's by far, that is the worst feeling on the planet. I mean, when you're like, yes, I'll buy all of this, and we're sorry, sir, we can't get authorization from your bank. Should they start blaming you for that one?
No.
You started talking about how you really started developing AI and machine learning back in 2005, when the idea of a computer thinking on its own was still related to Terminator. Almost, right? How have you seen that evolve in the last 14, 15 years? I mean, how has AI and machine learning evolved, not in terms of technology, but also of human perception of the technology?
So I guess machine learning is pretty much in our daily lives all the time, whether we realize it or not. So even like using Google Maps to be able to, or Waze to be able to move around, there's AI and machine learning in the background, figuring out what the optimal route is. And I think some of the changes have really been the evolution of a lot of the algorithms have almost now got to a point where they're very much commoditized. Like in the early days, it was a race in terms of what were the different types of machine learning algorithms and how could we make them learn better from the data that's available. And I think there's been lots of investment in terms of getting those to a point where there's so much value in those algorithms, and now it's more about how do we use the data in the best way that we can, and how do we make sure that the information going into those models is up to date. So traditionally in a lot of the scenarios that we work with, is fraud is constantly changing. The fraudsters are looking at weaknesses there. Those weaknesses usually get blocked, so they move on and they try something else. And how do you make sure that you can continue to evolve to those different fraud attacks or those fraud vectors which are taking place, to make sure that you're not making decisions based on past information. And when we see that happen, is you usually see bigger impacts in terms of customer experience or those declined transactions, which we're always trying to avoid.
It's very interesting. I don't know if you saw this, and we kind of didn't talk about this previously, but I think it's eBay that removed all their gift cards from every single kind of supermarket or anywhere you could buy an eBay gift card because of the fraud that was going on gift cards. Do you feel like that's going to be also one of the things that people start looking at is, the gift cards as being how fraudsters are really monetizing some of the data they're stealing?
Yeah, well, there's a class of products which are very sort of attractive to fraudsters because they're very easy to resell and monetize. And buying a gift card is almost like buying cash. So it's got a very high resale value. So I guess that's always what part of a fraud system is looking at. Well, what is the type of transaction which is being made, or what is the collection of information, or what is being bought is really key to that.
A lot of CISOs are concerned with AI for multiple reasons. We're seeing now in the cyberspace, we're seeing AI-powered ransomware, which is crazy. There's one specifically targeting financial banks and industries called the TrickBot ransomware, which by all means is probably one of the most advanced ways that hackers have been able to weaponize AI for bad purposes, and I specifically use the word weaponize for that. But the other part of it is its ability to discern the right information, of AI to be able to discern the right information.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you address those concerns and questions by chief information security officers and some of those, bigger banks? I mean, I've spoken to a few of them over the last few days prepping for this interview, and a lot of them have said, how much can we trust AI to not be manipulated by the bad guys who will start to create habits and patterns that, otherwise AI, a human eye might notice something and be like, okay, that's fishy, whereas an AI is just programmed and it can continue to roll. How do you address those concerns?
Yeah, and it's a really interesting area because you're starting to look at how the hackers are using AI is almost to slowly modify their attack vectors to sort of probe and understand where are the weaknesses, and to do that I guess historically you could do that in a very brute force mechanism, is you could keep trying and trying and trying until you succeed, and you can start to use AI to make that process more optimal. So I guess you're not giving as much evidence to your attempts in terms of how you're getting through. And I guess on the other side for the CISO is that you're seeing the hacking attempts amongst a majority of good customer data. So the noise ratio is very different, and that's what the challenge is. And then even within that data set, how do you start to truly identify where the breaches have taken place? There may be breaches taking place that you're unaware of, and if you're applying AI to those, especially sort of a machine learning where you're trying to learn from that data, is you could actually be learning from data breaches which are taking place and thinking that they're good transactions. So that's where you need to look at a balance of looking at, well, what is the normal and expected pattern for those customers and that data to come through? Do I expect these systems to be able to talk to each other, these data transfers to be taking place, and being able to blend those two things together to start to say, well, what is the normal and expected pattern versus what sticks out and isn't there?
You started talking about synthetic IDs, and I think that's really one of the most fascinating vectors of monetizing data right now that's challenging not only organizations, but I also think governments, because if you're creating a synthetic ID, you could end up with a tax bill from from your local tax authority going, you've been doing all these different things. Where's our tax revenue for these specific things? How can AI help identify synthetic IDs? And how do you kind of build and address that challenge over, we live in a global world, and you're Australian born, you're living in the US. I mean, I'm a dual citizen. Yeah. I've got, residency in 5 other countries. And so how do you address the evolving nature of how people kind of move in the world today to synthetic IDs? Because the fraud is everywhere. It's not just here.
Yeah. And experiencing that myself, moving from the UK to the US is 2 years ago, you essentially had to start from scratch, as there was being able to obtain a credit card or a loan or those types of things was almost impossible because you don't have that history in a lot of those sort of systems that have been built up to date, which sort of govern a lot of those processes. And that's where you then have to almost think about, well, what do I need to do as a consumer to start to provide those information into the credit bureau so that you can elevate your credit score and being able to do that. And I think it almost goes back to where we do look at fraudsters and hackers as being organized, is what is the level of effort that they need to go to try to like make someone look as real as possible. So as an individual, I go and buy my groceries, I buy petrol, I do all of those types of things in my profile, not just repay loans or pay off my credit card debt. So I guess it's looking at not just in terms of how is someone building up a credit history and repaying loans, but how are they using all of their financial products together, and does that represent someone who's a legitimate person who's needing to use all of those services?
The whole concept of synthetic IDs for a lot of security folks, I don't want to say it's a foreign concept, but it can also be used almost in insider threats, right? I mean, you talk about user behavior from the level of a consumer standpoint in credit cards, but it can also be an internal access card of an employee, right? I mean,
it could be, yeah.
The technology could be translated internally as well into an organization, correct?
Yeah, as well as it could be the synthetic IDs applying for jobs or getting access to those types of systems as well. So it's a combination of all of that where they're trying to combine information together to get access to something that they shouldn't normally be able to do.
Do you find the challenge of being able to really gain and monetize credit card data, which today sells on the dark web for, it's the cheapest data you can buy today is credit card data.
Yeah.
I mean, it's literally the cheapest data. I mean, you can buy thousands and thousands of credit cards for pennies.
Yeah.
At this point. How does that change the way you view the amount of data that gets sold into calculating the fraud that these guys are doing using AI? I mean, there's so much. I mean, I think every single credit card number at some point is out there.
Yeah.
How do you really discern what's real and what's not? And how do you discern when someone, I saw this recently in a marketplace, and that's why I'm gonna ask you this question. So I was in a marketplace in the dark web online, and we noticed that one hacker was selling credit card data based on geolocation.
Yeah.
So he had data up there that was only Kansas, US. So if you're a hacker, you can buy that data and know that if I can monetize this data, I can only monetize it within Kansas.
Yeah.
How do you start addressing those? I mean, because the hackers are getting more sophisticated in how they're selling this data to begin with. I mean, we're noticing it significantly online.
Yeah. And I guess it's almost then trying to, when you identify that fraud is taking place, is almost going up the food chain and saying, well, where did the compromise take place for that data? So was it that there was a common place where all of those cards that are seeing a collection of fraud taking place, did they all buy gas at a particular gas station? And then you can start to work backwards and say, well, what are all of the other cards that bought gas at that gas station? Mm-hmm. And now they're potentially at risk. So what do we do to put additional mechanisms in place? So almost going back to Minority Report and looking at pre-crime is you're trying to predict that these cards are likely to have been compromised, and then look at additional controls on top of those cards for any future transactions.
So being that we're in Atlanta, we have a few very sensitive topics here in Atlanta. One, I'm not from here, so I can say this. The Falcons blew the leads to the Patriots. What was it, 28-3? Yeah, I'm sorry. People in the back here are cringing. They're like, don't say it! The city of Atlanta getting shut down. Finally, Equifax, which had national impact on 48 million American adults. Probably you and I were part of Equifax.
I think I was lucky that I wasn't here when from that data set that was breached. So.
How does that change the way you program your AI? A breach of that magnitude, where it's social security numbers, it's credit history. I mean, the fact is that you were talking about synthetic IDs, and when you talk about synthetic IDs, to me, the only thing I hear, the only thing I'm seeing in my head is Equifax. How does that change the way you do business and you start kind of identifying transactions?
It takes away the trustworthiness of all of that data. So previously, where you could start to look at if someone did validate their name and address, is you now know, well, all of that data is now available for a period of time, and it's going to be very hard to discern whether that's a genuine customer or not. So then it relies on what are the other signals or pieces of information that we can put together that overlays trust on top of that. And it's going to take a while before there's enough, like, people don't move, like, it's when people start moving houses and you get new information about that which invalidates that historic data. But that's going to take years and years for that to actually play out.
So you brought up a very good point. Until someone moves a house, until someone really changes all his credit cards and he closes everything at bank A and goes to bank B, and now you're able to authenticate. But a hacker might do the same exact thing with that data, would he not? I mean, a hacker could be like, oh, I see on this credit report this guy's with, bank A, and I don't want to say bank name for the sake of, not getting a letter from their PR team that goes, James, stop saying that about us. I've gotten a few of those. Those are never fun. But it happened to you. I mean, it's real. And so never mind. But when you look at someone who, if I'm a hacker, right? And I always like to think that if I'm sitting in the hacker chair today and I have the Equifax data in front of me and I see Dave Excell and I go, look, he's at bank A. I'm going to go to bank B, and now I know all your data points and open accounts there. Again, going back to synthetic IDs, kind of like what you've been talking a lot about and been mentioning and been saying, like, this is the biggest kind of threat vector today for not only organizations but governments and individuals. You wouldn't know anything about it until you went to check your credit report, and an average American checks his credit report once every 9 months, I think.
And that's one of the biggest threats that is now, is a lot of that initial account opening and validating, is this someone who is real or not, and not just if they're real, is it actually them that's creating it? And that's where we start to look at not just the information that they're submitting, but how that information is either being like the path to actually creating the account. So if you're a fraudster, is what the process is to open an account on bank A, bank B, bank C. Right. And if that's very natural to you and you can do it very quickly, versus if you're browsing around, you're looking at how does the product work, what are the fees, what are the interest rates, that tells us something different about you as a person even before you open the account.
When you moved here, did you have to go physically to a bank to open a bank account? Were you unable to do it online?
Yeah.
Isn't that the worst feeling? You're like, online, oh, I can open a bank account online. Then all of a sudden you're like, you have to drive to the branch. You're like, no. Do you feel like biometrics is going to help kind of synthetic IDs in the future?
I think it does help, yeah. So it is a way of it's another data point that we can use to start to say how trustworthiness is that person, or how, and even sort of things like passive biometrics is what was the way in which someone browsed, or how were they using their phone? Like, was their phone actually moving or not? So you see classically a lot of those photos of like mobile phone banks of hundreds of mobile phones always plugged in, not moving. Again, another signal in terms of the trustworthiness of that actual device.
When you think of, you just kind of brought up a very, very interesting point. A phone that doesn't move, we know is a phone that's just really weird. Hey, this guy only accessed from this one IP address. This phone's always there. It's never really leaving. And that kind of goes into, kind of personal, I guess, privacy and biometrics and this whole piece of it. Do we have to change the way we start looking at data points? I mean, do we just have to take the traditional data points and throw them out the window and come up with new ways of identifying consumers and just people in general?
Yeah, and I guess that's like, if you look at how you're principally identified here in the US, it's via your social security number. That seems to be the one piece of information. If we actually look at the security and the validation that is around that, it's very poor. And then you start to look at, like, even in Australia where they looked at introducing a national ID card, is how do you start to create the controls around that? And also, what do you do if that gets compromised yourself? So if you're the actual person that's been defrauded or hacked, how do you sort of reinstate that ID, and what is the process that then creates?
It was funny. I told you before we started recording, I spent 3 months in Australia. And I cleared Australian customs quicker than I clear US customs. Because you pre-register, you go in, you scan your passport at a machine, you walk up to a machine that takes your face, that literally takes your picture, and then it opens the door and it says, welcome to Australia. I didn't even have to speak to a human at customs the entire time I was in Australia. And I flew back. I was in New Zealand, and I was in Hong Kong, and I was in Japan, and I was in Korea while I was there. Like, we traveled around. Yeah. And every time I came back, I was like, this is easier than the US. In the US, I have to stand in line. And someone asks me questions, and in Australia, the only questions I got asked is, are you bringing in food?
Yeah. Are you going to destroy the environment?
Are you going to destroy our environment?
Yeah.
But do you feel like that kind of approach to border security can be applied? Because they look at a different data point. They're looking essentially at your biometrics. They're looking to verify that you are who you say you are. Do you feel like that's also going to change in the financial industry? I mean, is that kind of the future of...
And I think it's what is the piece of information that we hand over to authenticate who we actually are. So at the moment, it's very much driven on sort of username, password, usually sort of a one-time password, which is texted to us. And that's the mechanism that we authenticate who we are. And it's going to be, what is that next level of information that us as consumers are willing to hand over and think that we're willing to give to those organizations to define who we are and how do we use that.
But isn't that part of our personal security? I mean, don't we... I think security always comes up with kind of a level of privacy that you're giving up.
Yeah.
Right? And so when you think of, what you guys do at Featurespace and the product and the way you try to not only help organizations, but individuals. I mean, at the end of the day, if someone creates a synthetic ID of me, I'm a victim, as well as the financial losses that the financial organization's going to suffer.
Well, they are synthetic IDs of someone that doesn't exist. So they're actually creating a profile of someone by combining lots of pieces of information of other people. So versus someone who's actually creating an account directly of you. So there's sort of a slight nuance there between those two. So
wow. So they're actually creating fake humans.
Fake humans, yeah. And entering those into the systems and building credit histories for fake humans in terms of creating financial products and credit around those people.
Wow. So could that impact population numbers?
Definitely. So if you're looking at number of consumers using devices, it starts to balloon into there's a whole bunch of potential fake or synthetic people out there that are having these interactions with different organizations.
Wow, I'm going to have to revisit my Facebook user numbers now. I wonder how many of the people on Facebook are synthetic at this point.
Well, it's almost a parallel to like what we're seeing as like click fraud in the advertising industry is almost a parallel to them what's happening in terms of creating synthetic people that are now using those financial products to build up a credit history. How
does social media play into AI and machine learning when you're trying to verify someone and trying to authenticate that they really are who they say they are?
So it's another interesting, it's a trust element and privacy element in terms of, and how you automate that. So if you enter your information, you could do a search on Facebook, you could do a search on Twitter, and you could say, have I seen this person? Are they active on that particular data? And it gives you a trajectory of information that can start to help validate that. But then you've also got to look at those false positives. So your dad probably doesn't have an active Twitter account. So
he does not.
So how do you make sure that he can still engage in those services as well? So there's the balance between those two items.
It's so fascinating because the generational difference in the way we adapt to technology really changes consumers' behavior. Like the profile of a 60-year-old white male is different from a 18-year-old female, and the geographical differences are crazy. I mean, I think almost everyone in Los Angeles or New York has a credit card, but when you go to middle America, you're in Kansas, Missouri, Montana, South Dakota. A lot of those people still operate by cash, and they use their cards for, what they consider big purchases. And so does that change how AI, is that where AI really benefits, is it's able to really kind of consolidate all that data and create patterns that you're able to recognize?
Yeah, and not apply something holistically. It's being able to understand the different ways in which those products get used. And also, interestingly about social media is the information that we post there, we may not expect to be then going into our line of credit. So if you're talking about going out like a big night on Vegas, and then do you want that information to feed through the next time you get to apply for additional credit for your credit card? That information currently doesn't get put together. So do we as consumers want all of that data to come together for those purposes?
Do you feel like one of the key challenges that a lot of organizations have, and CISOs I talk with when it comes to user identity, and we're not talking about the data breach aspect. I think a lot of times the main concern in cybersecurity is what you exactly address with your technology, which is the financial fraud, and it can be insurance claims, it's healthcare claims. I mean, there's just so much fraud beyond just credit card data. How does the Featurespace kind of fraud product really apply across different industries? I mean, can you really kind of take it and dress it to identify different things, or is it specifically financial?
It can be applied. I think it's always then going back to understanding what is being monetized, where does money move hands, how is that information gained to be able to approve that transaction to take place, and what are the different variables that can start to take place. Especially when you go into insurance, like going from like an auto claim to a household claim to then like health insurance, the range and complexity of the different services and products there is, you need to make sure that the machine learning algorithms can interpret that correctly so that you get the right results and you don't impact people incorrectly.
As a CTO, and your technology is continually evolving, I mean, you guys are, I think, at the forefront of a lot of the fintech innovation that's going on at the moment. How do you continue to evolve and grow with and adapt to new technology, whether it be AI, machine learning, blockchain? I mean, there's so many different technology, quantum computing, which I think is, some people say it's 20 years away. I quite frankly think it's maybe 5 to 7 years away from seeing a real, actual, working, good, reliable prototype of quantum computing. How does all that really how do you address all of those different innovations and still kind of maintain a level of security in not only in your organizations, but as part of the supply chain?
So I think it's employing smart people. We've got a great team that's always fascinated in challenging what they do today, is not taking for what we do today for granted, is always looking around the corner and saying, well, what are the innovations that are taking place? How can we test what we're doing today to see, are those innovations superior? And if they are, how do we learn from what's taking place in those environments? And then making sure as we start to make those evolutions is understanding, well, what does it actually take to take an innovation or a new feature, a new concept, and actually properly productize that into something that's deliverable and usable by a customer, and all the things that they're going to expect from like the compliance, the data privacy, security, all of those types of things that then go around in terms of sort of realizing that and being able to put it in use of customers.
There's been talk about regulating AI.
Yeah.
Is it even doable to regulate something like AI? I mean, can you write a law that would regulate AI effectively?
I think it'd be really challenging. I think what you can start to do is put governance and processes around what is the data being used to drive AI, and how do we make sure that that's being applied correctly. So I think it's always really important to look at making sure AI isn't discriminating against people. It's being applied in a very sort of open area. So I think that's where we need to make sure that as it starts to impact our lives more and more, is that we're giving it the right information to be able to make those decisions, and we're not sort of favoring specific areas of the population.
But do you feel like AI could do what a human actually does, which is, you said the word discriminate, but even identify and kind of people based on violating their civil liberties? You know what I mean? Like, you can't discriminate against someone based on, the race, gender, religion, whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, I have yet to see an AI modeling that identifies females as weaker than men in different things, or, prefers white male over Asian males or anything like that. That's typically a human behavior, and AI is supposed to be a level up. So do you feel like that's a real challenge within AI?
So I guess there was a great example where they looked at an AI algorithm that would help sift through CVs for job applicants. And one of the weaknesses that they end up finding and turning that away was all of the people that were employed were white men. And so what the algorithm ended up doing was looking at keywords that identified that rather than the actual skill set of the people. Wow. So that bias was learnt by the algorithms themselves. So every time they saw a CV that was from a female, it was automatically rejected just because all of the outcome data was all men. So that's where you start to tie in, so making sure that the information that goes into those systems is actually representative of what we want to be there.
That to me is so mind-boggling, because in my innocent mind, I keep thinking of AI as being this pure form of modern thinking in a way of being able to discern not based on any of those qualities, but rather on the qualifications. But you're saying that machine learning, there's been proven cases where machine learning has really tried to adapt to what humans look at in a such...
It's almost trying to automate a lot of the decisions and processes that we make ourselves. So even if you look at the sat nav of how we go from one location to the other, is it's learning from what all the other drivers do and how that they get from A to B. And so what is the most efficient route for that? So it's learning the bias of what's naturally there within the population.
I wonder if you were like on Google Maps and had 100 people drive into a body of water, if it would start directing people into a body of water.
It probably would, yeah.
Wow.
And so you can actually, if you look at, if you take a route that not many people take, you can start to bias it by going a different way. And over time, it will start to take you, like suggest that route yourself.
Wow. I've got one final question for you in respect to time. So I want to ask you kind of, where do you see the future of Featurespace and how do you see that all kind of coming together for helping address not only fraud and human behavior, but also in cyberspace and cybersecurity?
So I guess for us, it's like one of our missions is to be able to risk score every transaction in the world. So it's how do we make sure that all of those financial transactions are as secure as possible, and how do we use technology to make sure that as a consumer your money is not being stolen by the fraudsters, and that we can make a frictionless experience as possible and only start to introduce friction where there is potential risk. So sometimes as consumers, if we do go to somewhere new and we do make a transaction, is we feel protected if there is an extra check to make sure that that transaction is legitimate. So I think that's part of it. And then continuing to look at how the technology evolves and making sure that we keep in pace with the fraudsters, and we make sure that the platforms continue to be as effective as they can be.
Awesome. Dave, thanks for being here today. I really appreciate it. This has been so informative because it's a different view from the traditional episodes we typically have on CyberHub Engage. We're always talking about kind of security and the CISA point of view, and you've brought in a completely different perspective, I think a really fresh point for our viewers and listeners of how, I can think of 500 ways I could probably take Featurespace now and transform it into insider threat programs and so many, my mind's just racing at the different ways the technology that you guys have can be really used to address some of the most difficult challenges that chief information security officers have in an organization. From taking a data point from a financial transaction to user behavior on an internal network by an employee and the various transactions they make within the organization, whether it be, emails, ordering, procurement, so many of those, and then being able to identify when someone is moving too much data out or downloading something that they shouldn't be downloading, or communicating with an IP that they shouldn't be communicating with. Those are all just different applications of the stuff that you can do with Featurespace.
No, definitely. There's some really exciting problems out there to go and solve.
Especially on the human side, because that's what you guys really address. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show was because you brought the human behavior that I think people are so focused on technology and security, they're forgetting that, you can... My favorite meme on the internet is a meme of, the Great China Wall, all the great missile defense systems in the world, the best weaponry. And there's a gate. And behind the gate is a fat guy just clicking on everything.
Yeah.
Right? And to me, that's just the ultimate challenge in security in general and in fraud is you can have all the greatest, latest technology. But if the guy operating it is just a slob, you're really not... None of that technology is really going to be helpful, and you guys actually help address that element. You guys help address the behavior of the fat slob to identify, no, override that click, please override that click quick. And you do it when it comes to financial transactions. And so that's really great work. Thanks for being here again. If you're watching, listening, you can check out Featurespace online. We have Dave's LinkedIn information where you can interact and kind of pick his brain. I'm sure I'm a volunteer him to
definitely
to answer any questions or kind of interact with them and check out really what's happening on the human side. We're going to continue to focus here on the human element in security because that's really the most important element of them all. Technology, there's a ton of. Technology is not going anywhere. Humans are here to stay as well. And we're still going to be clicking on computers. We're still going to be traveling. We're still going to be doing all these things. And how do we address that going forward? Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. My name's James Azar. Follow me on Twitter, James_Azar1. Subscribe to us on YouTube, iTunes, or any of your favorite podcast platform. Make sure you review us. We are the fastest growing cybersecurity podcast in the country today. Thanks for watching and thanks for listening.